24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Middle Path Radio, your Islamic companion.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to another episode of Straight Talk on Middle Path Radio with me, Quddus Ali. Wherever you are listening from, a very warm welcome to you all. Tonight we are discussing a very interesting topic. We are trying to understand whether English law is compatible with Sharia law. Most of you will agree with me that Sharia has become a very loaded term, and it is incomprehensible to compare a system of law which is not really in practice anywhere in the world with the system which is widely respected in the world, which is English law. Please remember, this is a live and interactive show, and I would welcome your participation in this show, inshallah. So please call in or text us on 0747 708 0248. What do you think? Do you think we can compare such a system? Let us have your say on this. What about your experiences of English law? Is there a such thing as natural justice? Should we make such comparison with English law? To highlight some of the issues for us, I have two guests in the studio, alhamdulillah. I have a brother, Wakil Ahmed, who is a solicitor by profession and a community activist. Brother has been on the show before. And I also have our regular contributor, Nizal Hussain, a civil engineer and a political thinker. Assalamu alaikum to you both, brothers.
Wa alaikum assalam.
And Jazakallah for coming.
Thank you for inviting.
Barakallahu fiqh. So if I can start with Brother Wakil. English law is one of the most widely accepted system of law and order in the world. Could you please explain how this is manifested in practice in society?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you, brother, for inviting me onto your show.
You're welcome.
So, I mean, just maybe to give a bit of a background in terms of what is I suppose we're talking about the concept of justice. So let's define the term justice. So we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak. So justice can be described as fair treatment of people. It is, in essence, to treat people reasonably and fairly. From another angle, justice means to punish those appropriately who commit crimes. So punishment by the state, but in my view, justice has many facets to it. It has the individual facet, it has the state, and it has the collective societal facets. So I'd probably come from various different angles. So that's just sort of to set the parameter of this discussion. Hopefully, we will no doubt discuss this in a broader context. Now, as we know, English law has been principally built on two main areas, which is the Acts of Parliament, and they have the courts, which have over the last few centuries they have developed their laws, and that's commonly known as the common law. Now, in essence, those laws are built on the secular liberal values, and that's probably the most important part of it, which is it's built on a certain worldview, and it is built on the view that those laws have no place. Religion has no place in those laws, and those laws are made in a context of human thinking.
So I'll give you an example. Jazakallah khair. So, for example, in a homicide, in a charge of indictment for murder, you have trial by jury in a criminal court in this
That's
country.
Right.
So these juries are ordinary Joe public. They will decide on somebody's life whether he's guilty or not. Now, do you think there is a problem with that? Because trial by jury it's been a customary practice for a long, long time in this country in criminal law.
Yes, it's been built for centuries. Actually. Yes.
Exactly. So these individuals who are invited to attend jury service, they are the ones who are really going to be deciding on the facts whether this person is guilty or not. Is this really a way to determine whether somebody is guilty or not?
I'd say I'd broaden that question slightly. I think the problem isn't, in my view, with the jury system per se. I'd say one can criticize the way the legal system sometimes works. For example, we know that in high-profile criminal trials, you've got wealthy people who can afford very highly specialized barristers. Some of them are world leaders in how they speak. So these are very well-trained orators, and sometimes, or you could say often, they can influence how members of the jury think. They can influence and they can manipulate how evidence is presented. So, in other words, maybe to use Andrew Gilligan's term, they can sex up the evidence, so to speak. Now, when you've done that, and once a lawyer, he doesn't necessarily convey any lies, but he perhaps bends the rules slightly. Perhaps he manipulates how the evidence is exhibited and presented. Once you've done that, in my view, that perhaps goes quite far away from the notion of justice. That's no longer justice. Now, as you say, the Joe public, who are members of the jury, they will surely be influenced by your top-notch barristers who know how to manipulate the public opinion.
And sometimes what you see, that's very, very true what you say, but at the same time, even without going through all of that, when they see, for example, somebody on the witness box, the person, the suspect, and if he presents himself in a certain way, so for example, if his eyes are red and he looks a little bit funny, they'll say, they will go inside the private room, the jury's and say, he's done it, I'm sure he's done it. He's a draggy, he's this, he's that. So do you say, this is not really fairness? Well, I mean, how is that fair?
I think the other problem in this, I suppose, in the notion of justice, the other problem modernity is presenting is trial by the media. And I think that is also a major problem. If we look at, for example, let's look at this area of terrorism. We are now witnessing increasingly that suspects, who usually happen to be Muslims, suspects are tried by the media well before they even get to the courtroom. Now, there is a problem with that. The problem is a person who's been arrested is supposed to be in origin innocent until proven guilty. I'm afraid the media has already found him guilty before the trial has even started. Judges are obviously human beings, just as members of the jury are. And in my view, that trial by media is a grave injustice on the suspect, on his person, on his integrity, and on his future. So in my view, if we're going to talk about this idea of justice, we have to broaden it and look at how society as a whole is interacting with this notion of justice, and how sometimes injustice prevails through these other areas. The law may be, in origin, set up to achieve justice, fair enough. But how that's then prosecuted and how that's then promoted in the media, or how that's manipulated in the media, often gives rise to injustice.
Jazakallah khair. Brother Nizar, do you want to come in on this point?
Yeah, just to elaborate. So, for example, the brother mentioned about how, I would like to mention something about the Gagging Order, which is to do with you could have politicians, famous people who they can actually restrict what accusations are made against them. And anyone who asserts any such accusation, the Gagging Order can be used against them. Do you see? Whereas you find Joe Blogg's average member of the public, someone like this, as soon as they're put on trial, say for example, a teacher, a father, a husband, and he's been accused of rape, it's in the media, before the evidence is presented, before he's found guilty, within the public eye, right, he's already guilty. Do you see? Because an allegation like this, it's such a horrible allegation that even if, once he's proven innocent, the media damage is so immense. It's only his family who would have been in the court, who would have witnessed that actually he was innocent all along. But the damage publicly that's done to him, his prospects of getting a job, all of these things, all of these ramifications that take place. Yet on the flip side, you can have wealthy politicians who can use gagging orders to limit freedom of expression. But in other individuals, criticism and other forms of expression can be used to humiliate them. So it's inconsistent, that particular area of things. But another point which was discussed, which is to do with the jury system. At face value, most people think that, if someone's accused of a crime, they go in court, you effectively have a judge. A judge will judge the person. The judge will decide whether the person is guilty or innocent, and the judge will decide, the level of punishment, the of a crime. But actually what happens is you have an independent system where you've got the jury. So you have a group of people who are essentially members of public who are selected at random, and you have this for all court cases. You know, if you're a citizen of the UK and other countries within Europe, you could be randomly chosen as a member of a jury, and you have to go. You know, and once you go, you then pass a decision on whether the person is guilty or not. The judge decides on the
the sentencing,
the sentence itself.
Yeah.
And this is why sometimes you have situations where the judge who's experienced, who's witnessed many crimes like this before, may decide, you know what, the person is not guilty. And so this is, whereas the jury have decided, yes, the person is guilty. So where you have a clash like this is a classic example where someone's accused of rape. The jury decide, yes, he's guilty. And then for some reason, he gets only 2 years in prison. Or something along those lines. I'm exaggerating, but essentially you see there's a conflict between what the judge thinks is right and what the jury thinks is right. And because there's that disconnect, that's why we sometimes have in society, you know, in the media it will say someone was accused of and found guilty of such and such a crime, which was a horrible crime. The public was convinced, the jury was convinced, because the other side, the accusers, the prosecutors, they just simply had a better legal team. They could afford to have a better legal team.
But I'm sure some of our listeners will argue that, look, you still have a better systems than some other countries. You have 12 people, isn't it, Wakil Bhai? It's about 12 people, isn't it?
But 12 inexperienced people.
Yeah, jury. So it's not one or two people making arbitrary decision. Amongst themselves, they have to come to a verdict.
But
isn't that quite good then? I'm sure some of our listeners will argue that. How would you...
At the same time, the key issue here is that with the jury, fair enough, they're independent, but at the same time, you always see this clash between the judge and the jury. Who on the one hand, the jury, because of their inexperience, they haven't seen cases like this before. And so the barrister who's well versed in speaking to them, you know, a barrister could change his technique. If he judges the jury to be, say, very working class, he may decide to change his manner of speech. But at the same time, if he looks at the jury and he decides, you know, probability wise, they're very upper middle class, he will change his ways of convincing them. So you have really good expert barristers who've mastered and honed their skill in convincing people in how they do it. Now, this skill will not work on a judge, because a judge has experienced many court cases like this before. So this is why you always constantly see there's a disconnect between, the jury's decision that, yes, this person was guilty of such a crime, but then the judge always gives a lenient sentence. It's because, quite frankly, the judge disagrees with the members of public. So I think sometimes, you know, just as if you went to your doctor for medication, you wouldn't be democratic about it. You wouldn't go to 12 random people on the road and ask them whatever the majority of them think it is. You know, the majority of them can go to Sheikh Google and find out whether your loved one has cancer or not. You know, but that does not make those 12 people who go on Google, it does not make them experts on what is cancer. You still need to go to a professional doctor for that. So in the same way, the same thing applies with that analogy, which is a judge is better positioned in terms of they've seen all the tricks of the trade in terms of what barristers and solicitors say. They also have seen many court cases like this. They're better experienced at passing judgment as opposed to jury, in my opinion.
Jazakallah khair. I've got a question on sentencing for Wakil Bhai. Basically, you know, in terms of you got rape, you got theft, robbery, burglary. How proportionate do you think, based on your experiences, in fact, some of your personal experiences as a lawyer, in terms of, is it really proportionate? So, for example, a rapist, when he gets a years of sentence, is it proportionate to the crime he commits? Generally speaking, how would you respond to that?
There is an argument that the criminal justice system suffers from revolving doors. And what they mean by that is you've got criminals who are in and out as if they are going into the Bahamas on holiday. And some say that the inside is sometimes is a bit like Bahamas. You know, you've got the PS4 and all the leisures that you can think of. Now, coming back to your question, of course, a lot of people, especially victims, regularly, and we see it in the media, regularly
all the time,
get disappointed by the very lenient sentences. Now, there is a system in place. They can refer cases to the Attorney General's office. But the problem isn't that. The problem is you've got a system where the sentencing aren't deterrent enough to society. It doesn't tell members of society that, look, if you commit this rape, if you commit this murder, you will face very harsh sentence. And perhaps that goes back to the liberal values based on freedom. Those values are telling society that, look, don't take away this individual's freedom. Then the victim is asking, where is my freedom? Because I've been raped. But the perpetrator is apparently entitled to his freedom as well. So we know that sometimes in rape cases, the perpetrators get 2, 3 years, 4 year sentences, and they're out before you could blink your eyes.
They're out.
And that's because they're out, because obviously there are other problems, such as the prison system cannot cope.
It can't cope.
But I think putting the logistics aside, I think there is a philosophical problem, which is in essence saying, if you commit a crime, you could get out as long as you are seen to be reforming. Islam, of course, takes a different angle on this. Islam, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a bit, but Islam takes a different view, because Islam suggests that, and it mandates that the punishment system must act as a deterrent, so that the perpetrators don't commit that crime in the first
Prevention,
place.
isn't it? Then
Prevention is better than cure, absolutely. So, in this society, one need not be a professional to come to the conclusion that the sentencing system has some real fundamental problems.
And how is it fair that, there is a concept of sovereign immunity, whereby king and queens cannot be brought to a criminal or civil liability? Or diplomats as well. And they also get parliamentary privilege. I mean, how is that really fair?
Again, we are told again and again, and perhaps from your first year in law school, you are told that everybody is equal before the law. And there is an equality before the law. But unfortunately, the criticism is that's not the case. You have, as you say, the sovereign is free from prosecution. Now, of course,
some multinational corporations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know. I'm sure the listeners
MPs
know.
Expenses.
Yeah, the listeners know from their own examples how powerful people get away with it. So, if we look at, for example, as an example, the financial crash, you had thousands of bankers who got away with literally murder.
Subhanallah.
Because they were responsible for causing mass destruction to the economy, not just this country, but far beyond. And we only know 3 or 4 people who were actually sentenced. Only last week, a few senior employees at Tesco were charged for, again, manipulating figures. But put those small-timers to one side for a minute. If you look at the bankers who caused the financial crash, they got away with it. Philip Green got away with sinking BHS. As I was driving to this show, I was listening to Evan Davis on Radio 4, and he was talking about responsible capitalism. How do you deal with the likes of Philip Green? Well, you
can't bring them to justice.
Unfortunately, you can't, because
they're too powerful financially.
They're very powerful, and unfortunately, the system. You've got Frank Field MP, who was talking like a broken record against Philip Green. Unfortunately, we've not seen anything. In fact, Philip Green effectively showed the middle finger to people like Frank Field and told them to get lost. And so, on and on I can go about this particular problem. But unfortunately, law isn't, as a lot of people would argue, isn't applied equally. And I think the listeners have their own examples, and I've certainly mentioned a few.
Well, I think a key thing is, when we say justice is meant to be balanced, and literally the symbol for justice is literally a scale of balance. And but what's interesting is you see it time and again, it's not proportional and it's not balanced. So, for example, the case of celebrities can put a gagging order. But at the same time, so you cannot accuse them, or they cannot be accused by the media of certain things. Even though these celebrities, how much they've contributed to humanity is questionable. On the other hand, certain individuals, right, insult is defended as a value. So you find that it's inconsistent. And something the brother said earlier, he said about we need to create have a system that deters people
deterrent,
from as opposed to but at the same time you look at repeat offenders, sex abuse and things like that. So there's a 35% reoffence rate for child molesters,
subhanallah,
right? And 24% for rapists. So 24% of rapists, 1 in 4 of them, once they leave prison, they'll do it again, and a higher percentage of that who abuse children will do it again.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think they reoffend again? Because what's the main causes of that, do you think?
Well, the problem is the justice system, which is with justice, you provide a punishment for a crime that's done, and it has to be proportional. It has to reflect that. Do you see? So if someone does a crime that's incredibly dire, the punishment should be dire as well. This is just logic, common sense, but it doesn't seem to do this. So there was a while back a young man who's in his 20s. Actually, he's 20 years old in the US, and he was a hacker. He did whatever hacking he did, and he got 20 years in prison, right? Now, I'm not defending that. That's a horrible crime. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, you think to yourself, the years in prison he had to stay in prison for so many years, and you thought to yourself, this is crazy compared to the crimes that are committed elsewhere in the US. And the reason why I'm giving an example for the US is because the US system borrows. It's not the same as the English system, because we're speaking about the English system, but it borrows from the UK system, and it's evolved, it's changed slightly in its own way as well.
Jazakallah khair. So far, what do you think, listeners? Please continue to send your texts and with your questions and comments. Do you agree with our guest is here? Please let me have your thoughts on this. I do have a lot of texts, so I will just go through one or two of them. One of them is, how can you compare British law with Sharia? One is ever changing and cut and paste job, whereas Sharia law is for everyone. The poor, the rich, all are equal under Sharia law. Do you want to come in?
Well, the key thing here as well is because Sharia law it's a lot broader than many people think. When people think of Sharia law, they tend to think of just the hudud. They think of the penal code, the punishment system. So if you have something like the chopping of the thief's hands and things like this, at face value, this is what people think of when they think of Sharia law. But actually, Sharia law is a lot broader than this, a lot broader than this. In fact, it's not just a punishment system. It's far from that. The small section that deals with punishment is hudud. But you have things to do with the economic system as well. You have all of that. It's beyond just a penal code. But even in terms of to do with the penal code, and to do with the fact that English law is so broad, it's so widespread globally, in the sense that other countries have adopted it, not just the English system but the French system as well, because these two countries have an imperial history. So where they've gone and where they've spread, other countries in North Africa, Middle East, and so on, they've developed a mentality of, it's almost an inferiority complex, a need to try and imitate. So you have many of these countries, they've imitated the same legal systems. They may not have elections, right, but they still have the same systems in place in terms of how they define right and wrong, things like this. My parents are originally from Mauritius, and you find, in spite of the fact that the language, but the law over there, the language of the law in Mauritius is English. Right? So they've adopted it, and they have that mentality of, if you speak English there, it's seen highly upon. So it's that mentality of always trying to imitate. Yet in spite of the fact that they wear fancy suits, in spite of the fact that their legal system is in English, their court cases are in English, in spite of all of that, there's still corruption. It still doesn't stop the corruption. It's still there.
But the thing is, you say that, but when you see some new people coming into this country, say from our countries, they come and they get mesmerized by the system. How civilized, everything is orderly. So can we throw the baby with the bathwater? I mean, we've been discussing the problems and examining the problems here. But the thing is, there are some good. Some people, some listeners will say there are definitely a lot of good in the system.
There's lots of good. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, it's many of these countries in North Africa, in the Middle East, and various other parts of the world as well, even if they imitate a system like the English legal system, it would not allow them to propel as far forward as they'd like to believe. And the simple reason is this, is that the legal system in the UK keeps changing. It keeps changing. And more importantly, the system we have today, which, you know, many people would label progressive, the most progressive system that exists, the point is that legal system didn't even exist in the 80s, because what was acceptable back then is not necessarily acceptable now, and vice versa. And we only have to see, for example, this big myth. There's always this this ideological, almost sacred belief around nationalism, around British nationalism, that there was a great democracy of, you know, for the people, by the people, waving of flags, hands on hearts, and that historically there was this great historical era of great triumph and whatnot. But the reality was, if you look at history, look at democracy in history, you know, you only have to look at the facts. How when were people actually given the vote? It was
about 100 years ago.
Yeah, and I mean and not only that, to be an MP in the democratic system, it was up only until 1911 MPs were paid. And the reason why that's important was, before 1911 in the UK, all MPs were rich. They were all from wealthy families. Because if you were an MP, right, and you weren't working elsewhere, how did you make your money? So it was only people who were they were from affluent backgrounds who were MPs. Then in 1911 that changed. Then in 1918 women were allowed to vote. And then they placed those restrictions though. You had to be 30 years and over. You had to be married to a property owner, or you had to own your own property. So in 1918, when women were allowed to vote, which is half the population, how many of them were actually voting? But Britain became, so this is in the early 1900s we're talking about, but Britain became a superpower centuries before that. And it had nothing to do with giving the average guy a vote. The same thing happened with France. With France, the reason why France became powerful was not, again, because of its legal system. Do you see? So the key, I'm trying to point out something very key here. There's certain ingredients, you know, if you look at, for example, the Industrial Revolution in the UK, when children as young as 8 in Sheffield were forced to work ridiculous hours, you know, at the age of 8, until they physically became deformed. And once they reached the age of 10, when their fingers were not nimble enough, they were basically cast out of the factory. And when it became cheaper to outsource this to countries like Bangladesh to produce clothes in Primark, now that's done. So these are the key ingredients to the wealth and status and power that France, England has. It's actually very little to do with, you know, this emotional talk of democratic elections and all of this. So even if you have countries like Mauritius, Algeria, wherever, and they adopt the systems of, you know, parliamentary democracy and all of this. Because even parliamentary democracy itself is only representative. You know, once you vote for someone in power, you don't really... They then can create their own laws. The list of policies they promised they'll carry out, which is called the manifesto. Before an election, they develop a list of things, a list of policies they promise to enact. This is called the manifesto. But this manifesto is never legally binding. So they don't actually have to follow it. And historically, they generally don't.
For Brother Wakil, we see there's a lot of discussion in Parliament, in media, think tanks. They're constantly discussing about issues such as cannabis, prostitution, to legalize them. Can you explain why do they want to legalize these things? I mean, what's the main reason behind this?
I think there is a problem across Western societies about government's inability to deal with these issues. You've got drug abuse, prostitution.
It's everywhere.
Two examples to name, perhaps. The problem is they're so prevalent in society. You know, you've got almost every teenager out there experiencing drugs, including David Cameron when he was a young lad at Eton. And when you've got a problem as prevalent as that, governments are at a loss. They just don't know how to deal with it. You know, you have the leader of the third biggest political party, Tim Farron, is now saying he wants to make prostitution a career prospect for girls. Now you then think to yourself, am I awake or am I dreaming? You know, and that therein lies the problem. I think a lot of people like Tim Farron have realized that the state can no longer deal with some endemic problems such as drug abuse, such as prostitution. Because if you think about it historically, things like prostitution, these were forbidden, these were prohibited. Even we know that in the early part of 20th century in America, they tried to ban alcohol. They call it the era of prohibition. But at the end they had to back off. And in these societies, they try to deal with drugs, they try to deal with prostitution, brothels.
But if a woman wants to sell her body to generate income, that's up to her. Why would you have a problem with that?
That's the problem, isn't it? Because society as a whole has to determine what is good and what is bad for that society. Some people may choose to live in a certain way, but I suppose that goes back to the discussion of values. We perhaps have to ask ourselves, have liberal values indeed generated equity, generated justice in society? And I go back to my initial point. Justice is a very broader concept, and we have to ask, is it actually just? Is it actually fair to legalize drugs? Is it actually just to legalize prostitution, brothels? I would say no, it's not just, because if you look at the impact on society, it's far greater than the freedoms of few women.
Thank you. Brother Nizal, you wanted to come in. You were eagerly.
And you posed a question, what's the problem?
If a woman wants to sell a body to generate an income, well, what's your problem with that?
The problem is, I see that, to be honest, it's a cop-out for the government, quite frankly.
Can you explain that to our listeners?
It's a way of the government, they don't want to accept their failure, their inability to deal with the drugs problems, because we just mentioned drugs and we mentioned prostitution.
Very difficult to monitor.
But the thing is, the reality of both of them, there's a strong link between prostitution and drugs anyway. Do you see?
Sure.
So it's an issue where once you go down the slippery slope of drugs and hard drugs, it's an addiction which many people, whether men or women, cannot get out of. Do you see? So, and because we have a massive problem of drugs and prostitution in the UK, the problem is the government cannot deal with it, right? And the aim at the same time is to try and regulate it. In the case of Greece tried to regulate its prostitution and actually legalize prostitution. So Greece was prostitution does contribute to the Greek economy. Yet out of all of Europe, who suffered most? Is the Greek economy that effectively collapsed. I'm not saying it was caused by prostitution, but what I'm trying to say is this idea of everything should be based on capitalism and what's useful, what we can utilize. Sometimes actually that's very short. It's too simplistic. We need to look at it, consider the bigger picture.
Okay, I've got a question here from Brother Abdullah. He says, in Bangladesh, prostitution is legal. Why is it why a Muslim country, allowing such a thing? Brother Wakil?
We have to look at the legal system in Bangladesh. It is a post-colonial state, and its legal origins, the philosophy which generates the law in Bangladesh, are from Britain, to be very specific.
But they haven't legalized it here.
And that is the irony, isn't it? Sometimes to quote maybe Tony Blair, sometimes you become whiter than white. And sadly, when I remember in the maybe showing my age here, but in the 90s when Blair became the leader of the Labour Party, he said we are going to become whiter than white. And sometimes, unfortunately, in the Muslim world, they want to become whiter than white, and some of their laws, as in the case of Bangladesh, they go beyond what the liberals in the European states dare to do.
But when we say white and white, we're not saying anything wrong against,
Oh, no, we're not talking about. It's a metaphor.
Yeah.
Of course, we're not talking about this. I'm sure the listeners are clever enough to get that.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Would you say there is the similarities and parallels between Sharia and English law, Brother Wakil?
I mean, inevitably there are similarities. If you look at, you can look at a goat and a sheep. Of course, there are similarities, but I'd say there are quite fundamental differences, and that's probably where we need to focus for the next few minutes. I mean, the most, for me at least, the most important difference between Islamic law and English law is the source and its origin. Of course, English law is principally based on human being and the human mind. And the human mind endeavors to make laws which it thinks is better for itself. John Locke famously said, although he was a practicing Christian, he said, since Jesus is no longer with us, we shall make laws based on what we think is right for us. Now, of course, Islam has a complete departure from that line of thinking. And for that reason, Islam takes a different view. Let's look at how Islam.
How does Islam view law and order, justice?
Yes. So let's go back to Islam's definition. So the Sharia, this notion of justice in the Sharia is based on mutual respect of one person by another, and this is quite a broad principle. So Islam aims to create a just society, and it endeavors to secure everyone's rights against injustice, irrespective of a person's race, religion, color.
And even if you're an MP,
Absolutely.
if you're a multinational corporation, how would Islam view?
Absolutely. If you look at Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who had founded the first Islamic state in Medina, he had established a constitution which effectively regulated the relationship between the different religions and races within Medina. And it would be no exaggeration to say that probably was the first written constitution mankind had come across. And that state, was comparably small perhaps to today's states, but it had set the blueprint for a just society. And if you look at the Quran, I've got 3 ayat here which I want to just briefly mention.
Please go ahead.
You got one in Surah number 16. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna Allaha ya'muru bil adl. Allah says, verily Allah enjoins al-adl, justice. In Surah number 7, ayat 28, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Qul amara rabbi bil qist. Say, my Lord has commanded justice. And finally, I would want to touch this famous ayat from Surah An-Nisa 135. Allah says, O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witness to Allah, even though it be against yourselves or your parents or your kin, be he rich or poor. And then Allah continues that you must avoid injustice. Yeah, so this ayat is quite long. I don't want to go read all of it, but you could see how Islam makes a fundamental requirement that justice must be it must prevail against everybody, including your family members. You may be head of state, you may be wealthy, you may be poor.
So are you saying that the head of the state, the leader of the Muslims, can he be brought to justice? Doesn't he enjoy privileges and immunity like the way in the Western model?
If you look at Rasulullah,
because our listeners will want to know, when you say everybody, does it? The governors of the Muslim government, would they be accountable? The Qadi, for example, the actual Caliph, is he going to be accountable as well?
I'll give.
Is he above the law?
If we look at Umar radiallahu anhu, he was known for rebuking his governors, some of his governors who perhaps behaved inappropriately. He, of course, is known to have, in fact, whipped one of them, and he was a governor of one of his provinces. I don't know when last time a governor in modern West was whipped for misbehavior.
I think they need it.
Yeah. I want to quote one incident where this is the Prophet ﷺ's companion, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, radiallahu anhu. And one occasion he went to collect taxes from the Khaybar region, which some of your listeners may be aware was populated mainly by the Jewish community in Medina. Yeah. Now, some of them tried to bribe him so that, and obviously Abdullah ibn Rawaha has gone as a state official, and some of them tried to bribe him so that he takes less of the amount.
So we do get problems, it's not an we're not an angelic state. In our system we have problems, but
100%.
there's
and what did Abdullah ibn Rawaha said? In fact, again, maybe to use an example, this morning I was watching BBC News, and a staff member of the royal household was imprisoned because he was unfortunately he helped himself to £150,000 worth of bribes.
Oh my goodness!
This is just this morning. But anyway, what did Abdullah ibn Rawaha said? He said, "By Allah, I have come to you from the dearest of the creation to me," i.e., referring to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you are more disliked by me, but my love for him and my dislike for you will not prevent me from being just with you. And when they heard that, so obviously in this instant, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, being a state official, refused the bribe. He didn't take it, and he said he will not take that bribe. He refused. So they said, this justice is the basis which the heavens and the earth were created. So, I mean, I suppose as you say rightly, every society will have problems, and no one's pretending that the society which Islam looks to create is going to be an angelic state. Far from it. But I think it's about the philosophy. It's about the
solving problems.
It's about what sort of society does Islam envisage. It is about the vision. It is about the philosophy. It is about what does Islam want to create. And that's what I would say.
The biggest problem, though, I think, for Sharia at the moment in this given time is that it's not implemented anywhere. It's not implemented holistically and completely. So whenever you hear radio broadcasts by non-Muslim radio stations, whether it's any other media outlet out there, they always use this term. They always say, the 57 Islamic states. And in my head, I'm thinking, where are these 57 Islamic? What is he talking? Where do they exist? And
do they exist, or can you clarify to our listeners?
They don't exist.
What are the Muslim countries? Are they not? So, for example, just very briefly, Saudi Arabia, for example, or Iran. People have this notion that these two countries are effectively Islamic, or the ISIS, for example. Yeah. Can you clarify that for our listeners?
Well, the thing is, first of all, in general, look at the entire Muslim world in general. They always follow through from whatever colonial model they had before, and they carry through with that. So, and it's the same thing from the mentality at the ground level. The common man on the road wants to be seen as more Western, and that filters through right up into education, into the elites within the Muslim world. There's this belief that you need to be, if you know French or English, somehow it's an advancement. And the Muslim world has had this for over a century, and yet they're still backward. Yet they're still economically bankrupt. Do you see? So it doesn't matter whether you have Mauritian courts that speak English, your politicians are still corrupt. It makes no difference in Bangladesh. You can legalize prostitution, become progressive in that sense, but your politicians are still corrupt. So it clearly shows time and again, it's not these things. It's not this superficial political system that if you adopt somehow it will make you economically advance. Because the reason why France and the UK became economically advanced was centuries before they even had a functioning democracy, before they had a functioning, elections and things like this. So even if Algeria tomorrow became all clean shaven, right? And if they all speak good French, and to be honest, in Algeria, their French is pretty good.
Pretty good, definitely.
Compared to the Arabic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Okay. So even if they adopted that, it would not propel them militarily or economically like France and Britain already has done. Because the ingredients to Britain and France's power has nothing to do with this democratic ideological, propaganda that it spins and sells to the rest of the world. And unfortunately, the rest of the world, they'll swallow it, but they don't really understand the mechanisms of what makes an effective, powerful state. With the Muslim world, with the 57 countries, what we have is 57 majority Muslim countries. These countries have a majority Muslim population, but that does not make them Islamic.
Jazakallah khair. I've got a text from a brother. He says, basically, just wanted to clarify one of my points. He said, sorry, Quddus Ali, you said we have problems in our system, which is incorrect. It's the implementation of the law where people may make mistakes, not the system. So just to clarify for the listeners, what I meant was that we will be dealing with human beings in the Islamic Muslim society, and humans will always have problems, but the system, obviously, inshallah, is not problematic. It's the people I was referring to, just to clarify that. Brother Wakil, you wanted to come in on this point?
Yeah, I mean, we're on this question, if I recall, we are talking about similarities and differences. And I talked about the fundamental difference being the source and its origin in terms of the Sharia. Now, one fundamental principle of the Sharia is that the laws of Sharia are divine, and they're not passed in a legislature such as the Congress or Parliament in this country.
So it comes directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Absolutely, and they have divine origin. They're from the creator of man. Now, if we look at, again, I suppose some people may have a different view on this, but if we look at, for example, some laws that are passed in the legislature in this country, MPs are open to manipulation by public opinion. They're open to manipulation by the media. They're open to anger in the media and the public mood. And they're open to knee-jerk reactions. So every time, you see, let's say, for example, an outrageous incident, whatever it is in society, the next thing you see is knee-jerk reaction, let's make more laws. And the other thing MPs are, unfortunately, open to is what we call demagoguery. Yeah, it's about which politician can speak the loudest. And we know that some politicians have vested interests. So put all of these together, unfortunately, you do have a potential for abuse even within Parliament. We know that special advisors, lobbyists, media conglomerates and corporate interest has a big hold on how the capitalist states are run. And now I wanted to touch on quickly on the recent terrorism-related law, which is the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015. Now that piece of law was a very rapid knee-jerk reaction to a reality of ISIS, and most listeners would be aware that this piece of law was rushed through Parliament. And if you look at how...
That's effectively cornering a community and targeted towards the Muslim community.
And even today, this morning, The Guardian published a letter which was signed by 140 academics in this country and abroad. And you've got well-known professors on... I've read the list earlier on. You've got people like Noam Chomsky there. You've got people like John Esposito, whose books I used to read at university. These are very well-known academics from respected institutions. And they're saying, scrap prevent. Prevent is essentially a product of the CTS, and CTS was rushed. So what I'm trying to say is that man-made law, I think, has this inherent susceptibility to being influenced by other factors. And unfortunately, sometimes justice goes out of the window. Now, we're talking about justice. If we're talking about justice, justice has to be completely free from these interferences. It has to be free from human interference. In Sharia, justice is free from human interference because it's from divine source. The Khalifa doesn't decide what laws to implement. I'm afraid he has no discretion.
So what you're referring to effectively is relativism, isn't it? So what is justice to you may not be justice to me. So, for example, in Europe, you might have interpretation of justice. In other countries, in the Muslim countries, some are not effectively the same justice because it's human beings making the laws.
Yeah,
they're subject to individual interpretation and subjectivity.
I think subjectivity in terms of implementation as well as the legislation. So my point is, if we look at I want to focus on terrorism legislation because a lot of these laws are enacted after a certain incident. And what you don't do is you don't make knee-jerk laws because as soon as you do that, you open yourself to injustice.
Jazakallah khair. A lot of the time, Brother Nizal, in the media and in a lot of the think tanks, unfortunately, they select issues such as, the rules on apostasy, for example, under the Islamic system. And they say, look how barbaric this is. Just to clarify that on these issues, can you just clarify how, for adultery as well, adultery, fornication, and apostasy. These are things they attack us on. So if you can just clarify to our listeners, even the non-Muslim listeners as well, please.
The first thing to realise again is that these punishments, that's a penal code, right?
Yeah.
These punishments.
Penal code is hudud basically.
Right. Yeah. So whenever what's being discussed in the media is never actually Sharia law. It's always hudud we're talking about.
But even then they select it.
Of course.
Just to undermine it.
Of course.
So
but
clarify just for the listeners.
Just a quick thing about Sharia law that doesn't fall within hudud. If you have land, this is something that exists in the Muslim world. This exists also in the Western world. People, there's companies who buy out land and they don't develop the land. They wait for prices to go up and then they sell. That's the plan. So what happens is when you have these companies who buy large swathes of land and they don't develop it, this does not benefit the country, it doesn't benefit the economy. But under Sharia, within 3 years, if you own land, within 3 years you don't make something productive out of it, the state can confiscate it and use it for public purposes. So this is something that's, existed, is not limited to an illiterate person who lived in 7th century Arabia. This is clearly something beyond human intellect, that even politicians today can't come up with laws like this. So that's an example of Sharia law of where it can change something. But going back to hudud law, which is the more controversial, the media always loves to talk about
Absolutely.
this. It's not clear cut. It's never that simple. I mean, if we take some examples, with fornication, with adultery, cheating, and things like this.
The laws of evidence are very, very high. The burden of proof is very high, isn't it?
The burden of proof is very, very high. I mean, with the case of adultery,
you need 4 witnesses who have actually seen. Yeah.
I mean, the issue with adultery, it's just a list of things where the hudud is not strict on absolutely everything. There's a few things where it has a heavy hand, but there's a reason for it. So, for example, in the case of cheating, having affairs, right? That's an example. That's the first thing. Yeah. On the other hand, in other societies, you may have situations where on the train you have advertising, companies or websites for people who are married who want to cheat and have an affair. So
Ashley Madison, for example,
there's all these. It's not just them. There's other ones.
Absolutely, it's okay to have a mistress or a girlfriend.
This is all okay, but then at the same time, if you say something out of line about a celebrity, you get sued. But then if you cheat with someone and you break a family, right, then it's okay, and it's defended as a right. So it's a bit strange, how we define right and wrong. People innately, naturally have a sense of right or wrong, right? And what's happened now is the legal system in the UK and also around the world, in the Muslim world as well, doesn't even reflect that anymore. It's really strange. It's more beneficial for economy. That's how they see things. That's one example. Another example is when it comes to false accusations. So instead of, always attacking, we're always criticizing the Western world, we obviously have to criticize what's happening in the East as well. In Eastern culture, there's sometimes a strong tendency for making false allegations, false accusations. If Sharia or hudud was implemented in these countries, right, whether in the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, Bangladesh, many people who throw false allegations against women, they would think twice. They would think twice. At the prospect of getting 80 lashes for accusing someone of something, they would think twice. Do you see? So that's an example. It's not just something that Islam is not somehow born out of this Asian cultural traditional inclination. It's not. It has a lot of scope to redress issues that exist in the West and issues that exist in the East. And even when it comes to things like theft, which is something that's always brought up, there's 7 conditions before someone can even have their hands chopped. If they're accused, you need to have 2 witnesses who've actually witnessed the crime.
If it was food related, for example, if he's hungry and things like, if you can elaborate on that as well.
I mean, that's the one that most Muslims are aware of, which is that if let's just say it's the stolen goods happens to be food and it exceeds a quarter of a dinar, then in that case, which is about 4 grams of gold, 4.25 grams of gold, I believe it is. And so if someone was to steal that amount of food, right, which shows they're in a case of poverty, you cannot enact that law on such a person. In an Islamic system, you cannot implement that had on that person. So that's one example. You cannot implement that law on a person who's stolen from their family. You cannot implement that law on someone who's stolen alcohol or things which are haram to begin with. You cannot... and the item that is stolen has to have been stolen from somewhere that's secure. So if someone has stepped over has entered through your property and has stolen something, then the law can be implemented. That's an example. So you see again those 7 conditions. But going back to the most important condition of all, for adultery as an example, you need to have 4 witnesses who witnessed. And I don't want to be explicit. Can I?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
So 4 witnesses have to
You're referring to the penetration, isn't it?
That is it. So four witnesses have
to see physical penetration.
The physical
just to
penetration,
clarify to our listeners.
Now, the most important thing is, where on earth,
absolutely,
if there is an affair, would four people be in order to do this? So the law itself is actually very difficult to implement, first of all. Not only that, within the Sharia itself, there's strong... It's not just an inclination. There's a law within the Sharia which is you cannot spy in someone's property to begin with. So the chances of doing this is very unlikely.
It's minimal. It's very remote.
Having said that, there are in societies, and it's re-emerging now in the modern world, as it existed in pagan times, where signs of affection are shown publicly, and the threshold is even higher now. So people are snogging publicly, which is one thing. On a Friday night, or technically Saturday morning, 2 a.m., whatever it is. People are doing certain sexual acts outside in public, so it's a lot easier for four witnesses to witness such things. Now, just to curb, if you're doing something like that, and there's no legal system in place, there's no legal system to deal with someone who's having affairs with XYZ people. You have a situation like this. This is you need to create some law and order. It has to be done.
But just to clarify, we're not trying to impose Sharia law in this country, isn't it? I mean, just to clarify to our listeners, very briefly.
Well, this is the interesting thing, because whenever the discussion of English law, it's been titled, "Is English law compatible with Sharia law?"
Yeah.
But typically in radio broadcasts, LBC, for example, but also on the news, on TV, newspapers, it's always, is Sharia law compatible with Western justice?
Yeah.
It's always measuring up Sharia law. And the question is, why does this question even exist? Why does the question about Sharia law exist in the public sphere in the first place? And the simple reason is this. There's a huge fear-mongering that exists in this society, in America, in Britain, in France, that there's somehow some insidious, hidden attempt to impose Sharia law on the non-Muslim majority, which is complete nonsense. There is no such thing. One, practically it's not feasible anyway, first of all. Secondly, there is no attempt at trying to implement Sharia law in the UK to begin with. And, the false flag thing is, for example, the so-called Sharia courts in the UK, which again is nonsense. There are these so-called Sharia courts first of all, they do not implement hudud law.
They can't, they're purely a mediatory
exactly.
body.
I don't know the last time, I heard of someone who had their hand chopped off in the UK, right? The last time someone had their head chopped off in the UK, it was in the 1980s, skinheads who did something, and literally two roads away from where I live. This was back when my mum and my father were very young, and then these crimes happened. But anyway, the point is that this fear-mongering, in terms of Sharia courts, they offer a service when it comes to marriage
advisory,
advice,
exactly,
when it comes to divorce and things like this. And we need to bear in mind there are many Jewish courts and Christian courts in the UK who provide a similar service. So it's for people who their marriage is on the rocks. They want some kind of advice. They want advice from religious perspective. So they go to these courts, which is actually not even a court anyway.
It's not even a court.
They don't necessarily have anything legally binding unless it's a financial transaction, right? And then two people who want to do a financial transaction, for example, and for whatever reason they want to do it through a religious court, then they can do. But they both legally consent to do so. So, and where there are examples where it, for example, hudud is not implemented in any of the Sharia courts in the UK or France. It doesn't exist. So this is just fear-mongering. But the key point to remember is that why does this fear-mongering about so-called, Sharia law is being implemented, it's going to be forced, and why does it exist, right, at a time when many of these democratic governments are supporting dictators abroad and are supporting wars abroad as well? And that in itself, that gives us the answer why. If you keep the public under this fear that the Muslims are implementing or trying to implement Sharia law, you keep the general public under this fear. It basically legitimizes attacks in the Muslim world, because Islam, Muslims, dictatorships, all of this seems to be this one unified bloc that's a threat to the West, right? So long as Islam is this necessary evil, the wars abroad in the Muslim world become justified.
it's a lot easier to justify, the necessity of sending aircraft, to bomb Muslim. It becomes a lot more easy to justify because that's always playing in the back of the mind of many people living in the West.
So it's got nothing to do with Sharia being barbaric or anything. It's to create a pretext. Is that what you're saying? Of
course. First of all, the discussion of Sharia law and hudud specifically, it's always, you find interesting enough, when a discussion is made in a public sphere, they never give the Muslims the platform to respond. They'll never have an Islamic scholar there to respond. And the reason is intellectually, right, they'll be broken. If they try to do that, they'll be corrected and corrected again and again based on the myths they produce constantly. So long as the average person or even Muslims themselves feel that there's a Sharia takeover in the UK, it makes the wars abroad feel justified and necessary.
Jazakallah khair. We've heard a lot, brothers. If you can, Brother Wakil, just finally say, from your experiences, inshallah, you've had a good understanding and knowledge of both Sharia law and English law. Which one do you think really delivers justice from your experiences and your viewpoint?
I suppose people would say I'm slightly biased, so I'll try to be
objective.
I'll try to be as objective as I can. I mean, first thing to say is, from the English legal system, as a practicing lawyer myself.
That's right.
I mean, there are some good things, and there is a legal system that's functioning in this country, and there are many good things to say. But I think the question isn't about the good of it. The question is about, perhaps at a more serious level, can mankind achieve better? That's probably the question. And the other question is, what is the objective of man? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of man, one of his names is Al-Adl. Al-Adl means the just one, or the one who gives justice. And so what I would say is that Islam is not here as an enemy to man. Islam did not come to destroy man's well-being and his future prospects. Islam came to, in fact, establish justice. And I would say, if maybe I'll just give one example. If we look at the court system in this country, you can have a witness who would give evidence in a witness statement, and potentially he could be lying. As long as he gets away with it, and I mean, obviously, if he gets caught, then that's perjury. But if he gets away with it, that's it. He's got away with it. In Islam, on the other hand, this same witness giving evidence has to control his innermost thoughts, feelings, and motives. So, for him to lie on oath, he may have got away from the judge, but he knows deep down he will not get away on the Day of Judgment. And I think the thing about the justice system in Islam is that because it is divine, there is a concept of taqwa, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which plays a very pivotal role in this system. So I would say Islam tries to make a system which is better for human beings. It will try to, I'm sure in its implementation human beings will make mistake. But at least at a system level, at least at a philosophical level, Islam will, in my view, create a system where people will be impartial. Individuals, whether it's the judge, whether it's the witness, whether it's the lawyer, whether it's the prosecutor, everybody will have to play by the rule. They have to play by justice. Why? Because every one of them is accountable not only to the state, but to the creator of man. Each one of them have to act fairly, because if they don't, then they know that on the Day of Judgment they will be punished. And in my view, that thought in itself is very powerful.
Jazakallah khair. I hope the listeners have been clarified with certain misconceptions and confusion, inshallah. I would like to thank you all for listening and participating in tonight's show. And last but not least, big Jazakallah khair to both of you brothers for coming to our show today. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallah feek.
Remember, you can continue with the debate on Twitter at Middle Path Radio. So until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Middle Path Radio, your number one online Islamic talk station.